Take each game on its merits there.
Hello and you're very welcome to the latest episode of Each Game on Its Merits. My name is Eibhilin O'Reardon.
And I'm Jerry Farrell.
And today we're talking about the game in May of 1932 in Amsterdam against the Dutch. So, Jerry, what a romp this is. Now, this is not a good Netherlands side. They do not have a lot going on, unfortunately. They have a poor record, and we contribute to that poor record by beating them 2-0 with a very new side. We have 7 debutants in this team.
Yeah, so we are just over 5 months on from our humbling 5-0 defeat to Spain. But also a lot of interesting, talented young players coming through who are getting their first caps. And as I say, this is not a classic Dutch side. They've lost. They think they've won 4 out of their last 25 international matches. The Dutch are still amateur at this stage. Now, unfortunately, when we come to meet them in the near future, there's a kind of new generation of players with wonderful names like Kik Schmidt and Eibhilin coming through. But this team,
and they give us a bit of a hammering in 2 years' time in a World Cup qualifier.
But we'll get to that.
Get back to that.
But going back to 1924, there is one familiar face. We've obviously lost, unfortunately, to the Dutch in extra time in the Olympics.
Robbed.
Well, but there is still one survivor from that team 8 years on. Guus van der Meulen, the goalkeeper for Haarlem, which is just outside Amsterdam, is still the goalkeeper for the Dutch side. And leading their attack is the wonderfully named Wim Lagendahl, who has 9 caps and 12 goals for the Dutch at this stage. So he's a prominent goal scorer. So even though their win-loss ratio isn't great, they do tend to score a lot of goals. They go down swinging. So in fairness, They might lose 3-2 or 4-2 or whatever, but they tend to get goals. So we're actually quite impressive in that we keep them scoreless in this game.
We beat them 2-0. Paddy Moore is back on the goal sheet. So the Irish team, Mick McCarthy, a very famous Irish soccer name, is in goal from Shamrock Rovers, I think.
Making his debut, yeah.
Making his debut. Jimmy Daly from Shamrock Rovers. Paddy Byrne is not a debutant from Shells. Joe O'Reilly,
just after his 21st birthday, a Brideville player. We'll talk a bit more about him later.
Scores the first goal for Ireland that day. Mick O'Brien, we spoke about him before. He's now at Watford. Owen Kinsella from Shamrock Rovers making his debut. Now, Billy Kennedy, St James's Gate. Unusually, St James's Gate have not featured as a club in the lineup for an Irish team for quite a while. You say he's an interesting guy.
Yeah, shout out to Robbie Thornton, who some people might know from his kind of Twitter posts, who is, I think he's married to Billy's granddaughter. But Billy left an amazing archive of newspaper clippings, memorabilia, and really interestingly well-written diary notes. So he has kind of personal observations on a fascinating career right through the 1930s into the 40s of players he played with, and he keeps a kind of great record of all the different matches he's involved with. And Robbie shares a lot of that stuff on social media. So if you find Robbie Thornton on Twitter, do give him a follow, because he has great kind of insights on football in the 20s and 30s and 40s as a result of his connection to Billy Kennedy.
Alex Stevenson is a famous name. Now, Alex Stevenson makes his debut in this game. Doesn't play again, doesn't get a second cap for the FAI until 1946. There's 14 years of a gap between his 2 FAI caps. Plays for the IFA
numerous times.
Now, he thought, I think at the end of his life, he was still a little bit bitter about this. He thought because he was actually Church of Ireland, he had played for Rangers. He's still the only Rangers players to have got a senior cap for the FAI men's team during his, because Ciara Grant, I think, played for Rangers and the Republic of Ireland simultaneously, but he's the only man to have done so. Felt that was part of the reason why he didn't get selected. Felt it was a sectarian reason. The real reason, we believe, is because when he was playing for Everton, they just didn't tell him, and they didn't really fancy him playing for 2 Irelands simultaneously. Off you go, play for the IFA. We're not telling you about the FAI. Yeah,
so I've done a fairly detailed piece about Alex Stevenson on my blog, A Bohemian Sporting Life. Please do check it out. Stevenson is a guy who fascinates me. So he's a 19-year-old. He's playing for Dolphin.
From we think born in Richmond Road.
Born in Richmond Road, moved around quite a bit, but all in around that part of kind of East Wall, North Strand, North Dublin.
Yeah.
He starts playing football for a church team, St Barnabas Church, in the North Inner City. And it's interesting. His father is a Scottish Presbyterian background. His mother is
Catholic.
Is Catholic. Her name is Caprani, and they're originally an Italian family. And both the Stevensons and the Capranis have background in the printing trade, and we think that's how they met. And half of the Stevenson family are raised as Protestants in Church of Ireland.
The boys.
And
Boys are raised Protestants.
And
right?
half are raised as Catholics.
Right.
So now Alex is a talented young player. His father is actually is an official with the FAI. His father is on some FAI committees. His father, Alex Senior, and he and his brother play for St Barnabas. They do very well in a junior game. He's snapped up by Dolphin by Arthur Dixon, who is an English coach. Now, Dolphin have a reputation of bringing over a lot of English and Scottish footballers at the time, and they pay good wages. So Alex said that the cross-channel players were on £5 a week, and he was on £3 a week as a 19-year-old. He has a great kind of debut season. He gets Dolphin to the FAI Cup final. They lose that final 1-0 to Shamrock Rovers thanks to a headed goal by the diminutive Paddy Moore. So Paddy Moore's 5'5". Alex Stevenson is, like, depending who you listen to, he's 5'4", 5'5". These are two little guys. So Moore actually scores a header to win the final. But Dolphin have been in impressive form. Arthur Dixon, who has played for Glasgow Rangers, is then recruited by Glasgow Rangers during their coaching setup, and he brings a young player with him, Alex Stevenson. Right. And I think Dolphin get a couple £100, and then there's an agreement that Rangers will come play a friendly, which they played the following year in Dalymount Park against a Dolphin select.
He's interesting for a number of reasons. He also was a coach later in his life, but he the Everton connection. I mean, I was talking to Billy Rojak. Many people would know Barry Rojak from the Irish sort of football jersey circuit, and he tells me that of all the English-based players that played for Ireland until the 90s, half of them played for Everton. There's a huge Everton connection between Irish players, and he was obviously an Everton player during this period. His political connections are interesting in that his grandniece is Holly Kearns, who is the leader of the Social Democrats in Irish politics. So there's an interesting connection there as well. Anyway, we'll probably return to him again.
Yeah, because there's so much to talk about. Stephen, fascinating.
But he does play for the IFA, and tension between the IFA and the FAI is kind of coming to a head around this time. I'll just read out the rest of the players anyway. Paddy Moore, Fred Holliker, they have gotten caps before. More scores in this game. Jimmy Kelly, now there's a guy.
Yes.
Derry, he's a Derry City player, originally from Donegal. There's an interesting... It gives me a chance to talk about Derry football, because football in Derry, I've done a bit of research here, starts off, the Derry club is, say, Cullum's Hall, then becomes St. Cullum's Hall Celtic around 1893. Derry Celtic, founded in 1899. The reason why Celtic Park in Derry, where the GA team play, is called Celtic Park is because that's where Derry Celtic played back in the day. So there is a soccer connection with Derry Celtic. They kind of fall out of the Irish League around 19.
Well, Derry Celtic
13.
They leave and then they go back to the GAA code.
Yeah, it's interesting enough. Yeah, they left soccer and became a GAA side.
And Jimmy Kelly is the first player capped for the FAI from an IFA club. Now, he is born within the 26 counties. He's born in Donegal.
Yes.
And the other thing I do love is...
But Derry City were not founded until 1928.
Yes, so Derry City are relatively new. You know the story about how they got their colours?
I do, but I can't. It's based on the English side, and is it Sunderland or Southampton?
Sheffield United. So we've talked about him before. Billy Gillespie, again, born in Buncrana, Donegal, star man for Sheffield United in the early teens and into the 20s. He's part of that side that win the Home Nation Championship in 1914. He becomes their manager, and he changes their shirts to match the candy stripes of Sheffield United. So that's why Derry City wear red and white stripes. And
Derry, the previous Derry player, if you like, or player who was capped for the FAI Ireland side. I'll say this again. The previous international, the only previous international from Derry Celtic, was a guy called Bernard Donaghy, who we believe was capped in 1902 for Ireland versus Scotland in a game which was a benefit game for the Ibrox Disaster Fund, because there has been a disaster in Ibrox that year. He also joined the British Army, fought at Gallipoli, died at the Somme. But anyway, he's the last sort of player who had been playing for a Derry club who was an Irish international. Anyway, so that's Jimmy Kelly makes his debut. So we win 2-0. What's happening in Ireland at the time? Well, the general election 1932, February of 1932, that's when Fianna Fáil take over from Cumann and Gael. And at the time of the rise of fascism across Europe, there was not necessarily total confidence there would be a peaceful transfer of power, but there was. Now, we're talking a lot about the IFA, FAI sort of conflict. We spoke about Jimmy Dunn last week, who he said got a death threat from a Republican in Belfast for lining out for the IFA.
Yes, so that's in October of 31, shortly afterwards.
In the 5th of December 1931, he refuses to play for Wales against Wales in Belfast, right? And that's the end of his IFA career. Now, there's a lot of friction between the FAI and the IFA at this time. We spoke last week about Tom Ferguson getting his scroll, if you like, for turning down the IFA. He's presented with this with great aplomb at the game against Spain, and things are getting hot and heavy. So what's interesting is in this book, James Quinn, No Foreign Game, he describes a meeting that took place in February of 1932. So it's before this game. Yeah,
this is another attempt to broker kind of an agreement between the two associations in Ireland.
We're possibly pushing it a bit to say that the two associations wanted to come together, but they certainly wanted to resolve.
They come very close here.
Yeah, right. But there was differences, there was argument, there was players who were being... It probably didn't help the tension of the time. I'm assuming both associations wanted to dial down the tension.
Yeah,
the sectarianism that's in the in the game in the north, Belfast Celtic, Linfield, all that history of stuff. There's now players with IRA backgrounds not presenting themselves to play for the IFA, and in an attempt to and
high profile,
very
successful players.
So. So Jimmy Dunn
he's banging in goals at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, so it says here, in an attempt to resolve outstanding disputes and improve relations, the two associations, which is the IFA and the FAI, met in Dublin, which is a bit of a concession, in February of 1932. Again, time of the general election, time of great change in Ireland. That might have actually settled things a little bit, the fact that there was a transfer of power peacefully. They made some progress, the IFA agreeing in principle to the establishment of a joint committee with equal representation for both associations to oversee international affairs. Okay? Now, that to me looks like overseeing international affairs. Is there the potential for having one side?
Yeah, that there'd be a committee that will select the team, select the panel, select where games will be played,
right?
And then also it gets Ireland, the FAI Ireland, back into the Home Nations Championships, those lucrative games against Scotland and England and so on, but also means that maybe they could play games against some of the continental sides that they made connections with over the recent years.
Right, so we're only 10 years into the split here. So the identities of both sides are not set in stone.
Yes.
And maybe this could have been...
They've been together longer than they've been apart.
Yeah,
at this stage.
And they probably know each other from pre-split. So, or some characters there from pre-split. So there may have been an opportunity here to mend bridges and to sew things back together again as other associations were operating. So the FAI then requested a seat on the IFAB to give it full equality in international affairs. The IFAB, Jerry?
International Football Association Board. It still exists today, and it is still made up of the associations of Wales, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and a seat for FIFA as well. And they are the people who decide on the rules of the game, still to this day. So if you want to change the rules of football, it has to be approved by a majority of the IFAB, International Football Association Board. Yes.
And it's still a kind of a Brits only thing, including Northern Ireland.
Yeah, but you have FIFA as... Now, they've weighted the votes slightly differently as well. But yeah, so if you want to say, we're reducing instead of 11 sides, 10 aside, it has to be approved by the IFAB. So there is still a disproportionate influence by the home nations.
I'm balking at this. Right, so the IFA balked at this, arguing that as a FIFA member, the FAI was already represented on the international board. That is not an unfair...
And it's probably not within their gift to give.
Right.
So if they can't say to the English FA, the FA Wales, Scottish FA, oh, by the way, you're giving another seat to the FAI. So there'd be two Irelands. Now, if you're head of the English FA, you're probably Lord such and such or Sir such and such. Do you want two Irish associations and FIFA on your little club?
No,
Probably not.
Not likely. The negotiations broke down, and the subsequent recriminations left the two sides further apart than ever. Afterwards, the IFA lobbied the English FA to ask English clubs not to release Free State players for international duties in the hope of forcing the FAI back to the table. But it didn't work.
So we might come on to our friend Alex Stevenson on this, because, and if anyone wants to read a bit more about this, if you're a big nerd for conferences and delegations, I'd recommend Cormac Moore's book The Soccer Split, which is very good and goes into a lot of detail on this. But Alex Stevenson, as you said,
is he a test case?
I think he is, and well, I know he is because I've seen the minute books of Everton Football Club to prove it.
You are such a dork.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
says the guy who co-hosts a podcast with you on every Ireland game ever played.
It was your idea.
It was my idea. It was my idea.
Yes. So, Alex Stevenson, as we say, goes to Glasgow Rangers. He's only there for a year, and then he is so successful there. He wins the league title in Scotland. He's signed by Everton for a kind of a significant amount of money.
This is a seriously impressive, successful Everton side.
Yeah, he's going to be the man.
Dixie Dean team.
Yeah, so this is the team being led by Dixie Dean. They're going to win a league title. So this is impressive sort of stuff. This point about not releasing players. So we'll come to an Irishman and a man with a very Irish name, and they become part of this. Alex Stevenson, the last interview he gave to Sean Ryan in the 1980s, just before he passed away, he said he could never really find out why he went so long between getting his second cap. Now, obviously, the Second World War intervenes. That explains a number of years. But why, when he's 19 and he's already capped, doesn't he get a cap thereafter? The secretary manager of Everton is a guy called Theo Kelly. Now, despite his name being Theo Kelly, he isn't an Irishman. He's from the Isle of Man. And he is very unimpressed about releasing players for international duty, especially for two Irelands. He reluctantly enough releases players for the IFA, but he's not that impressed about releasing players for the FAI.
Right.
Enter another man, Monaghan man, John McKenna.
Oh, disaster! Hey,
John McKenna, who along with John Golding is instrumental in setting up a Liverpool Football Club, and he's a Monaghan man. So he's.
Oh, I've heard of this guy.
So John Golding is, the guy who owns Anfield, and Everton don't really want to pay rent there, and there's a dispute, so he sets up his own club. John Golding is a prominent Conservative politician. He's a member of the Orange Order. He becomes very good friends with John McKenna. John McKenna becomes the main driving force with Liverpool. He also later becomes head of the FA, and he issues a missive to all the league clubs that basically encourages them not to release players to the FAI on the back of this request from the IFA. So they're basically saying you don't have to, and we're encouraging you not to release players to the FAI because of this dispute. And this is a man born in County Monaghan and has a plaque to his name in County Monaghan.
It was bad blood then.
Yes, and this only really changes. Theo Kelly kind of softens his cough later on, and in the post-war years, he's happy enough to let Alex Stevenson go to games. And Stevenson is a hugely popular player. Dominic Behan has a great piece where he talks about there being Everton fan clubs in around Russell Street in the north inner city that go over on cattle boats to see matches in Goodison Park, because Stevenson is such. And just to describe Stevenson, he's a little guy, but he's incredibly skillful. Like, he is like a Wes Hoolahan, I suppose. He's that style of player. He's a little guy with amazing trickery, amazing ability, and he's a bit of a clown prince as well. He kind of he loves nutmegging big centre halves and playing balls off their shins and making shows of lads as well. So he's a real entertainer. So he's hugely popular in Dublin. And, actually the two Behan brothers kind of mention him in their writing. Dominic and Brendan talk about what a great player he was.
Okay, at some point we're going to get back to this game.
Yes,
that we win
against the Dutch.
Against the Dutch, yeah. And it's a substantial win. It's a 2-0 away win, but we have to remember that the Dutch aren't any great shakes at this time.
They're 100% amateur at the time, and remain so for a while longer. Some of the great generation players that are going to come through haven't quite come through yet, but we have a good smattering of young players coming through. One we mentioned there, Joe O'Reilly. He's just turned 21. He's playing for a team called Brideville. He's played in a cup final already as a teenager. He lost out to Shamrock Rovers, who scored a goal through David Babby Byrne. We mentioned him before. He does a bit of a hand of God thing and punches the ball into the net, and Rovers win the cup.
They're always at
it. So he's done well for Brideville. He's a half back. So to describe that, he's not a centre half, but he's kind of a pivot player. He's a player who's a deep line midfielder. who is tough, who's strong, good in the tackle, but can also play a bit. And he scores a great goal. He has a kind of rasping shot from the edge of the box in the first half, which gives Ireland the lead. And then Paddy Moore scores a cracker from outside the box in the second half to give us a comfortable 2-0 win. And this is...
Did I read the... I don't think I did. No, I didn't.
Oh, you didn't read the match report?
Yeah, the Irish team using short passing, which is obviously something that they've picked up from the Spanish game, showed better control and understanding than the Dutch and deserved their victory. The Dutch nearly opened the scoring when Lagendal shot against an upright. They're always hitting the bar on the upright these days, aren't they? That was against the run of play, and the Irish pressure was rewarded when O'Reilly scored with a long, hard, swerving shot. Ireland's second goal came soon after the break when Kelly and Kennedy gave Moore the chance to score from 25 yards with a low, hard shot. So Moore has some game.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's won his one cap for the IFA just before this. And also, I think we're playing better football, but we're playing like Stevenson is a proper baller. Paddy Moore is as well. Yeah. Billy Kennedy is a good technical player. So we have a good technical team here. And so impressive are they that Jimmy Daly, who's playing for Shamrock Rovers, Paddy Moore is playing for Shamrock Rovers, and Joe O'Reilly, who we mentioned, who's playing for Brideville, are all signed by Aberdeen, who are in the top flight of Scottish football.
Yep.
They have a manager called Paddy Travers, who keeps a close eye on Irish football. He actually unexpectedly passes away in Dublin on a scouting trip much later on in his life. But he signs all three players for the grand cumulative total of £1,000.
Wow.
And Daly doesn't have that great a career at Aberdeen. He's back at Rovers relatively quickly. But Paddy Moore and Joe O'Reilly do very well in the Granite City. And Moore, I think, in his best season, I think scores 26 goals for them. He scored 18 in the league this season. So Moore is a real danger and is probably the star man in Irish football at this point.
And he really explodes onto the record books in the next game that we'll do is the 4-4 draw, this famous 4-4 draw against Belgium in 1934, which is our first competitive game, we might say, since partition. Which is a World Cup fixture. So all these games that we've been describing for the last number of episodes are all friendlies.
Yeah, and we might
I don't
look
know
at
if that
friendlies.
really matters as much in those days. I mean,
I look at it the way the rugby fans look at a test match against South Africa or New Zealand or whatever. It's still a
and the idea of international competition outside of the home nations for any other sort of country is probably a bit of a
it's a bit new. I mean,
idea.
We've had one World Cup which didn't have qualifying. In fairness, there is the Copa Sudamericana, which we now would know as the Copa America. That's been running kind of in a strange kind of format since 1919, but again, that's very far removed from our players. So there isn't really a comparative example. But this World Cup thing, this could be this could have some mileage in it.
So when we do play, literally 2 years later against the Dutch, they get the revenge. So we have a 4-4 draw against Belgium, and the Dutch, who you say have a very, very poor record, they hammer us 5-2 in only 2 years' time. And now we're into a series of World Cup games, World Cup qualifiers, question marks over various different associations in these islands and what legitimacy they have. Football is no longer in the Olympics. It's not involved in the Olympics in 1932, so it's kind of gone off that stage.
Yeah, and look, we don't send a team to the Olympics again until 1948 in London. But we have, as you say, qualifying. The first World Cup is an open invitation. The second one, which is going to be held in Italy, has qualification. As you say, we have a qualifying group with the Dutch and the Belgians, and obviously Europe hasn't fragmented as much by this stage in 1930, so there are fewer nations to compete against. Our old friends Holland and Belgium, we meet them again. And actually someone who's going to feature quite a lot is Joe O'Reilly, who we've mentioned. This is his debut cap, but he's the first man to reach 20 caps for the FAI, and it's a record he'll hold for many years until it's broken by Jackie Carey.
A Rings End man.
And he's a Rings End man, but not by birth. He's actually born on the north side in a place called Willett's Place that no longer exists.
Claim him then.
We'll claim him as a north sider, but he did grow up in Rings End. He was a familiar of the likes of Jimmy Dunn and others, and we'll hopefully have a little bit more a little bit later about Joe O'Reilly.
So we don't play in 33 at all.
2 years without a game.
2 years without a game, undefeated in that time. And our next game is against Belgium in 1934, February 1934, which is a World Cup qualifier, and that's when Paddy Moore really rips it up by scoring 4 goals. But we'll talk about that again. So Jerry,
well, we might just finish off by saying
yes,
we don't have we have 2 years without a game. We've mentioned the Spain games were good for the association financially.
Yeah.
Already we're skint because we get a guarantee of £500 from the Dutch FA, and it costs us £510 to pay the players and get to Amsterdam. So we're already at a loss here, and the FA are short on cash. So they're hoping this World Cup thing really works out, because if it doesn't, they're in serious trouble, and they're not going to have. We're pretty sure from that meeting in February that we're not going to have the likes of the home nations, England, Scotland, Wales, playing us anytime soon.
We're locked out of that. In fact, we don't play England until 46, which is a while away. Right, as always, Jerry, brilliant stuff. And so next week we are on to that famous game, Ireland 4, Belgium 4, February of 1934, and Paddy Moore is the man of the hour. Right, that's on our next episode of
Each Game on Its Merits.
So we're delighted to have on the podcast today Bob O'Reilly. Now, Bob O'Reilly's father was Joe O'Reilly, former Irish international, the first man to be capped more than 20 times by the Republic of Ireland, or the Free State as it was back then. So listen, welcome to the show, Bob. We were talking just before we came on air there about the focus of our match being Ireland versus the Netherlands in 1932, and you said that's a game that has some interesting stories behind it. It's the game that your dad, Joe O'Reilly, made his debut in as a young man. He just turned 21. So what do you know about that game? And let's have a quick chat about that.
Well, how are you, Jerry? It was his debut, and at that time he was playing for Brideville, who were a team in the League of Ireland based in the Liberties, played their games out at Richmond Park and latterly in Harold's Cross. But they travelled over to Amsterdam, and the FAI were notified by the Dutch authorities that the band didn't know the national anthem, the Irish national anthem. And my father at that time was playing clarinet in the number 1 Army band, and he was able to write out the music on the eve of the match for the band, the Dutch band, and everything went off perfect.
Well, that's a great story, because in one of the early episodes, we talked about the match against the Italians in 1926, and it was played in Turin. And from reading the reports, it seems like the band that the Italians had was kind of like the equivalent of the Artane band. It was all schoolboys, and they didn't have the sheet music, and there was no music played because they had some sheet music there, but they said the kids couldn't learn it in enough time for kickoff. So we've had a few issues on the podcast about anthems and things like that, and even going back to the Olympics. The Soldier song wasn't played. It was Let Aaron Remember was used as the song for the team. So, well, you've kind of started us off on something there then, because you mentioned there your father was a great musician and the army connection as well. So I know that's a family thing, that he was in the army. His father before him was in the army. His father, Michael, who has a very interesting sport and history as well. So maybe just would you tell us a little bit about Joe's early life? Because I know he's another... when I was researching him before, in the article I wrote a few years ago, having chatted to yourself, he was born on the north side, but he's another one of those footballers who grew up in Ringsend, which is a great footballing heartland in the early days of independent Ireland.
Absolutely, yeah. The family lived in Stella Gardens in Ringsend because Grandad O'Reilly, Dad's father, he was a sergeant in the British Army at the time. Notwithstanding that, he was also drilling and training. I think there were pro-treaty, whatever IRA men in the Ringsend area. And he was from the stories that I can capture about him, he was a unique character. But Dad, there was 15 of them, and a lot of tragedies struck the family. Various deaths when they were babies or whatever, you know. But there's one particular story about how they moved from Ringsend. There was twins, Peter and Paddy, and both of them got sick. And Paddy died, and the mother would not stay in Ringsend and literally moved over to Home Farm Road. But the other twin that survived was Peter O'Reilly, who latterly played for Dublin and won an All-Ireland and trained a lot of Dublin teams.
That's amazing. Now, look, I'm recording this in around the corner from Home Farm Road as we speak, funnily enough.
Yeah.
But that's an amazing story, really. Obviously, it shows the sporting connections, and we talk a lot about in the podcast about the overlap between players who played both, soccer, but also played hurling and Gaelic football and things like that. And I know from our chats before and looking at his military records, Michael O'Reilly, the grandfather, as you said, was an interesting man, a member of the British Army. But when I found him, he had an exemplary military record, except for April in 1916, when he was basically kind of put in the brig, as it were, in the middle of the rising. And you kind of wonder if maybe that's an example of his sympathies with the Republicans and that sort of stuff.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it actually was re-employed when the Irish set up their own army in the Curragh. He was a physical education instructor, but the stories are legendary about him. He wasn't a big man, and he used to do handstands in the pub in the Happy in Rathcoole in the Cozy Bar when he'd have a few pints on him. But an amazing character by all accounts.
And maybe just tell us a little bit. I know we could probably go off on a big tangent, but he had his own sporting involvement, and he had quite a success as a trainer of the Kildare Gaelic football team.
Yeah, one of the earliest photographs I ever came across was of a soccer team that played out of Shelbourne Park, where the Greyhounds are now, and they were called Dublin City, and they wore stripes. But he was down as the trainer of those. But if I can just put sort of how they came out to Rathcoole, Daddy was playing with Brideville, and they were playing in Cork, and Daddy had bought his younger brother John a pair of roller skates. And while he was away with the match on Sunday, John fell off the skates in Home Farm Road. And when Dad got off the train in Drumcondra, he walked up to Home Farm Road, and immediately there was crowds outside the house, heard his mother wailing. And another brother, he died that night. So the family moved literally overnight out to Saggart because Grandad was based in the Curragh at that stage. But I presume when he was in the Curragh, that's how he got the call for the Kildare job, whatever. 1920, he trained them in 1926, but the last Kildare team to win Sam Maguire was trained by Michael O'Reilly, and there's various photographs of him in the picture,
So, like, he's training the Kildare team in the late 20s. Your dad kind of comes onto the scene in the late 20s as well, makes his debut for Brideville as he's in a cup final, I think, as a 19-year-old.
That's right, yeah, they were beaten by Rovers.
And he makes his debut for Ireland at the age of just 21. And then he has a very successful career. He goes and joins Aberdeen almost immediately after that Ireland match with Paddy Moore, who we've talked about on the podcast before. Paddy Moore, one of the great strikers of that early day, late 20s, early 30s, things like that. And obviously then he moves over to Scotland to play. Do you know much about his club career? Because obviously he comes back and has quite a success in League of Ireland, but he does spend a couple of years over in Scotland.
Scotland wasn't a happy period for him. If you knew my father, he was a real homeboard, Now, notwithstanding he had been in the army, but did not take to the regime in Aberdeen at all. Now, the people over there, he said, were absolutely couldn't have been nicer. He corresponded with the couple he stayed with for years afterwards. But and the manager was Paddy Travers, but he never settled. And he would say himself, lost his form, lost a bit of confidence, as you do, But Aberdeen was cold, aptly named the Granite City.
Yeah.
And didn't work out for him. And
some of the kind of characters we talked about on the podcast, people like Paddy Moore and Jimmy Dunn and people like that, who had been teammates of your father's and in some cases probably neighbours in Ringsend, some of them. Did you have any stories about some of those big characters from Irish football from that era?
Not really. He was very close to Jimmy Dunn, and notwithstanding he had been away with Paddy Moore, but the both of those players, he said, would have made it in any era. That they were exceptional ball players. Moore was small, big-chested. He said he could leap like a salmon, and with the old leather balls or whatever, he'd power it. And he was a brilliant centre forward. He actually likened Frank Stapleton a bit to Paddy Moore. He said he could see things in Frank Stapleton that reminded him of Paddy Moore. Jimmy Dunn was an exceptionally nice man, and they got on very well. He had a great career in England, Jimmy Dunne.
It's a funny one as well because researching Dunn, he's such an interesting character. You know, he's interned during the Civil War. He's very vocal politically. He's be quite kind of left wing, and he makes a famous kind of protest ahead of the Germany match when they were playing over against Nazi Germany in 1939 and all this sort of stuff. But by all accounts, everyone talks about him being such a soft-spoken and kind of gentle sort of person, which is kind of, you know,
he was a couple of years older than my father, but he took my father under his wing, and Daddy never had he said he was an absolute gentleman. And they were going, when he had finished his career, when Jimmy Dunne had finished his career in England, he was playing with Rovers, and I think it was Norway they were going to. Now, at that stage, the travel, they'd go from the North Wall over to Holyhead, train down. But when they were going through Southampton, they were boarding, or the boat was pulling out of Southampton. About 200 dockers on the line, on the side, were all cheering and waving their caps as a tribute to Jimmy Dunne for the service he had played with Southampton as well, and he was highly thought of over there.
That's why after he'd been at Arsenal, he was at Southampton. And he saved them from relegation. Just before he went back to Shamrock Rovers. So yeah, I knew he was a popular character there. And what I find interesting is, and look, we've talked about a lot on the podcast, especially in the 20s. There were so few games played, and England and Scotland and things like that wouldn't play against the Free State and things like that. So there's so few matches, which I think makes your dad's achievement as being the first player to get 20 caps in that era, a huge achievement, especially when, a lot of players' careers were ended early by injury and things like that. So what would you put that down to, the fact that your dad was, I suppose, so consistent and won so many caps in an era when there might be only one or two matches a year?
Well, when he came back from Aberdeen, if you look at the records, he'd obviously lost his form over there because he missed out on another couple of internationals. Yeah. When he came back from Aberdeen, he was playing with Brideville, and he obviously regained his form because James's Gate signed him. But knowing my father, like everybody has the highest regards for their dads or whatever, but he was a perfectionist. Whatever he done, like the clarinet, he got into the #1 army band, even polishing his shoes down to, he just was a perfectionist. So I can imagine the preparation that they put into it, that he put into it.
And you think that's maybe down to the military discipline and his father being the physical fitness trainer and that sort of stuff? Maybe he was a bit better prepared, a bit more naturally.
Well, it was definitely an advantage. Like they used to, Peter and himself, they talked about these legendary training walks they used to do at night. They'd walk about 15 miles around the hills here of Newcastle, Rathcoole. Knew all the farmers knew them or whatever. As kids, he'd bring us up at Go Hill, doing our deep reading and all. He had things just ahead of it, diet, the whole lot. Everything was ahead of his time.
Clearly.
Absolutely, yeah.
And look, you look at some of the kind of more tragic players, people like Paddy Moore, who had, an amazing player by all accounts, but someone who had a difficulty with alcohol and things like that, where, as you're saying, your dad's doing walks and breathing exercises and things like that, and probably better preparedness.
Yeah. But there was one very sad meeting. I think the last time that he met Paddy Moore was Dad was going into an international in Dalymount, and Paddy was down on his luck outside of Dalymount, it broke his heart,
Yeah, and I mean, look, I suppose Paddy was someone who passed away when I think he was 41 when he died and things like that.
And Jimmy Dunne died very young as well.
That's right. Yeah, we kind of covered this actually only on the episode here today, that a great coach and trainer by all accounts, but died suddenly in his house, having gone down to meet the Swedish national team were playing in Ireland, and he went down.
That's right. I was
reading
it. Yeah,
I was having a chat with him and things like that. He went back home and then just died in the sitting room.
Yeah.
Just on that, I suppose, because your dad had played so many games, he got to travel a bit. He got to play in different places. He was, we were talking about going to Holland. He was in Hungary. He was in different places. Did he have any kind of interesting stories about the places he got to visit, or some of the other players he played against, or the type of football that was being played by other nations and things like that? Because obviously there's no TV then. You saw very little of continental sides.
Yeah, he never really spoke about it. I don't know who actually done the tactics or whatever, but I think the captain at that stage had a bigger influence than they actually do now, because the teams were selected by a selection committee. So it was down then to the captain. Jimmy Dunn captained the last game that they played in Bremen, in Germany. So, but like these were top class players. So I'd say it was whatever systems they were playing at the club, that old W formation or whatever was. But just going back to that Bremen, there's an interesting, the outside left, I think, on the German team was Helmut Schön. He scored that day. And he latterly, in 1974, was the manager of Germany who won the World Cup.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you look back at some of those teams and you look back where some of those players ended up, and some of them were great coaches and things like that. There was another game in the 30s, and on the team was Sepp Herberger, who ended up coaching them in '54 when they won the World Cup as well.
That's right, yeah.
And I know you showed me before as well. Some of the memorabilia that you still have, caps and like medallions and different things like that were presented to your dad after a trip.
Yeah, well, the caps are scarce enough. I have one, my sisters and that have, but there's a lot of them. You know, my father, Paddy Riley, the singer, worked with Daddy. Paddy's big claim to fame is he has two caps, Ray Tracy's and my father's. So they're, you know, he was generous. You know, but thank God I have one anyway. They were also presented with from the opposition. Like I've some beautiful medals from Norway and Czechoslovakia, and you know, memorabilia from the respective FAs, which is nice to have. I'll pass on to Owen and the girls here.
And actually, you mentioned it there, the Bremen match that Jimmy Dunn played in and things like that, and he got injured and came back on and things like that. Did you ever talk about that? Because that must have been such a strange experience. You're only two months away from the outbreak of the Second World War. He was playing in this very intense atmosphere by all accounts. He
spoke about that. Like the writing was on the wall. Everybody was in uniform, like civilians and everything, all with the swastika armbands on them, even at the matches. Well, there was a lot of the Nazi hierarchy at that match, and the place was heaving. And I think that's when Jimmy Dunn came into his own, like to the famous one about
remember 1916.
Remember, yeah, but a lot of that was in the, whether it was going back to the captain, motivating his lads in the dressing room. You know, be proud Irishmen. We faced this type of thing before. Remember Ockram, remember the heroes of 1916. So it was, you know, tapping into the Irish psyche.
I look, they got a great result in very difficult.
Fabulous results.
Yeah,
like Hungary. That's only you know, less than 20 years before Hungary should have won a World Cup, and Germany did win a World. You know, so like there were no daws.
No, absolutely. And look, I have a few bits and pieces I've collected myself from that era, and there's a great interview with one of the trainers who went across with the team that drew, I think, 3-3 with Hungary in the 30s. I think your dad was part of that. And he said, you know, this is the best football team I've ever seen. The type of football they're playing is amazing. They're already well ahead of what British football is, and if British football is to keep up, it needs to kind of adapt and look at what the Hungarians are doing.
I like that was an interesting question you posed there. Who developed the tactics, however, I don't know. And you know, it's things like that now that if you could go back and have a pint, you know.
Yeah. And as I say, most of these lads would have played just the same formation. Every club kind of played a very similar formation, and they would have said, right, you're the centre forward, you're the left winger, you're the centre half. I suppose just for anyone who's kind of unfamiliar with it, your dad mostly played like as what was called a halfback, which is kind of a defensive midfielder in the modern sense.
Yeah, right half, number 4. That was his. But he was from reading accounts and whatever, he was extremely fit. You know, and he up and down and covered, and
he got a few goals as well in his career. He got some significant goals. He scores on his debut, of course, as well.
Yeah. Going back to the Holland connection, there's a famous one where against Holland in I think it was in Dublin, or maybe it was in Amsterdam, I'm not sure. But he took a penalty against the famous Leo Hall, who was a highly thought of goalkeeper in Dutch football and Dutch history. But Leo saved it and saved the rebound as well. So in the late 50s, Radio Hilversum had a This Is Your Life program, and they reconstructed. Daddy was flown over to Hilversum from Dublin, live on the radio, and Leo Hall was in the goal, and Joe O'Reilly, blah, blah, whatever it was in Holland. So you got a good old trip out of that as well.
So 20 years later, you got to reenact it.
Yeah, in the studio in Hilversum.
Well, that's fantastic. I never knew that. That's fascinating to know now. And look, I know we have a couple. We're obviously doing a chronological series, so we have the I'd say that's probably one of the qualifying matches for the 34 World Cup.
Probably, yeah.
Don't look into the detail of that, but that's a great story to know as we're going to be profiling that match in a few episodes' time. Just before we finish up, Bob, any other kind of memories you have as your dad as a footballer? Because obviously he would have been thankfully unlike the likes of Paddy Moore and Jimmy Dunn. He kind of lived a long, full life. He would have still been around.
Well, even when he died, he was 81 when he died, Jar, and we were shocked because he did smoke, but if he smoked 10 cigarettes a week was his most. He loved a pint. 4 pints would be his max.
Yeah.
So everything was done in the strictest possible. Yeah. And he was so fit. He was still him and the terrier. You'd meet them anywhere. 5 miles from home. He was a real fitness regime, even going then. So when he died of a stroke, that was it was a shock. But they just getting back to his time in Aberdeen, it has such a bad effect on him that when the family were living out in Blackchurch, which is just beyond Rathcoole, the publican from the Blackchurch Inn came up and knocked at the door and said, "Joe, there's 2 men down in the pub. They want to see you." So my father went down, and 2 guys were one in each corner. It's a dog barking, sorry.
Okay.
Well, one was the manager of Chelsea, who were in the 2nd division, in one corner. Is that bothering you?
There we go. It's okay. We'll
and the other guy was the manager of Sheffield Wednesday, who were in the 1st division, and they were both trying to sign him, but no way would he was.
So that trip to Scotland and the couple of seasons he spent there, he realised he was happier at home playing in Dublin.
Yeah, for that vision, he said. Yeah. And Sheffield Wednesday were a crack team at the time, but there's no way. Like he was he had a car at that stage. Like he was, all things are relative. He was probably getting a nice few pound here at the time. It's James's Gate, where top team, and
so he would have got a few quid for James's Gate. Was he?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Was he still in the army at that stage, or was he working?
No. He was full time now at that stage with. Aberdeen actually is part of they bought him out of the army. They had to buy or whatever. They bought him out of the army, but he was on a full-time wage with James's Gate.
And obviously they still would have had the maximum wage over in England at the time. So as you say, it's not like now where a young lad could go over, leave the League of Ireland, make a fortune playing for a team in the Championship or the Premier League. It was probably much of a muchness in terms of the difference in wage and all that.
Yeah, well, they say the only people in Saggart that had a car at the time was the doctor, the priest, and Joe O'Reilly. So he wasn't doing too bad. So there was no way he was going to be tempted back across the sea. Anyway,
I suppose towards the end of his life as well, you sent me a few pictures of it as well, Bob. Is that he was recognised by the FAI. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, which was lovely.
So he did kind of get recognition for his career, because one of the things we always try to highlight on the podcast, especially these earlier games, that a lot of these great players are kind of forgotten by a modern audience who wouldn't know who Jimmy Dunn was, or Paddy Moore, or Tom Farquharson, or who your dad was. So it's nice that I suppose he's one of the few that kind of was around long enough to see his contribution to Irish football recognised.
But he was it was typical of the man. He was a shy man. He didn't really court that type of thing.
Yeah.
And then living out in Newcastle, where we lived, which was only 12 miles from O'Connell Bridge, but it was rural Ireland.
Yeah.
But when the Coleman would come out from Heaton's or Ted Castle's or whatever, he was an avid gardener. He'd be out in the garden, and I remember distinctly on several occasions Coleman saying, "You're not Joe O'Reilly of the Gate. What are you doing out here?" And out in the sticks. But yeah, no, that was him.
Like that's great, Bob. No,
But there's
great
one story, a good story about Paddy Moore. The day he scored the 4 goals against Belgium, he broke through again, and with only the keeper to beat, he flew through, stopped, put his foot on the ball, and scooped it up into the goalkeeper's hands. And the lads were slagging him afterwards. Paddy, why didn't you? He says, I didn't want to get him sacked. Like, that was the man. That was the type of man he was. He'd scored 4 goals. I could have had a 5th.
And look, could have had us at our first ever World Cup.
Yeah, we were beaten in goal. Only, I think, goal difference.
Yeah. But a fascinating character, and it's just, I always think it's just so sad that there's only tiny bits of footage of these guys from the 20s and 30s, and we there's not more we could see about how like, because the stories you read about him, I think everyone compares them. Probably the comparison that's most common, I think, is to George Best. There's in terms of the
Well,
ball.
that's what Daddy said. He had a swerve, and then when he'd stick his arse out, he said, when he'd shield the ball or whatever, and then swivel and be gone, drop the shoulder, and he said he had a chest on him like a barrel, and the centre halves, you can imagine the physicality that was being dished out then, but they bounced off Paddy Moore. And then Jimmy Dunn was a different type of player. He glided. He was crafty, like a rocket. Yeah.
And another man apparently great as a head. Like, even though neither man was a particularly tall, I think Paddy Moore was probably built. Sounded like he's built kind of like Diego Maradona sort of proportions.
That's exactly what I was trying to. But Daddy said he had an amazing spring in him, and the words he used was he could leap like a salmon, and had the ball. But just another, there's you'd say how good are these lads or whatever. I take great consolation. There was an article in the Evening Press, and it was with Jackie Carey, and Daddy played with Jackie Carey at James's Gate. He was signed by Manchester United, and they played about 3 or 4 internationals together. But Jackie Carey said that, now it wasn't on ability, but he said that Joe O'Reilly was the best Irish player that he saw. So,
and like, you would have known, you would have been a young lad when your dad was at a kind of established player at the Gate and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But that's some high praise, and considering
Well, that's
cup winning captain.
Like, he played for the rest of the world himself and managed Everton, the famous, got sacked in the taxi on Christmas Eve. Forest, they were only beaten by City in 1968. So, as a fella says, he knew his onions.
He didn't. That's high praise from Caesar sort of thing.
Yeah.
Well, that's great, Bob. Listen, really appreciate you taking the time.